my God, I have had this Congress. For 10 years, King George and his Parliament have gulled, cullied, and diddled these colonies, and still this Congress refuses to grant any of my proposals on independence, even so much as the courtesy of open debate. Good God, what in the hell are they waiting for?
Sit down, John! Sit down, John! For God's sake, John! Sit down! Sit down, John! Sit down, John!
That is, I believe, the first song in the musical 1776, a musical in which the founders, many of the founders of America, meet in Philadelphia to debate the question of whether they should occasionally sing. And the results of the vote are kind of mixed, actually, as you might even be able to tell from there. We're going to talk today about popular culture and the American Revolution and how really the two have had a very uneasy relationship, certainly in modernity and really kind of going back a ways as well. Part of it is just there's an awful lot of pressure on this story. The story needs to be a lot of things, and it makes it hard. Since it's an origin story, it makes it hard to deal with some of the unpleasant realities. Anyway, why should I be talking? We've got great guests to do that talking. Joanne Freeman's going to get things started. Then we're going to go to, I think, 6 or 7 of our Nose panelists. Joanne Freeman, been on the show many times, I'm pleased to say. The Alan Bowles Jr. Professor of History and American Studies at Yale, the host of 2 podcasts, History Matters and So Does Coffee, and a few thoughts for those who can't sleep. At my 50th reunion, so I graduated in 1976, I got to see Joanne and Beverly Gage and David Blight, who taught this kind of famous America250 course recently at Yale, do a presentation. Joanne, great to have you back on the air.
I am so pleased to be back.
So let's start in 1976. I was graduating from Yale, as we've just established. You were 14. And my sense is that the musical 1776 made something of an impact on you. Say a little about that.
It did. And I will say, other historians early American historians in my cohort have privately said the same to me. But for me, it did what I think Hamilton did for many people nowadays. And that is it made the revolution human. There were real people, granted, real people singing, but apart from the singing, it made what I think certainly to a 14-year-old seemed like a story of inevitable things that of course were bound to happen with a bunch of boring guys in a room talking boring things. And it was all on a pedestal and there was nothing interesting about it. And I think 1776 made the revolution and early America really human. And then I wanted to learn about the people.
It was also the 1976, therefore the bicentennial. You were an impressionable 14-year-old. I assume that was all kind of wrapped up in the things you're talking about right now.
Oh, for sure. I mean, the bicentennial. I mean, 14 is the perfect age to sort of absorb something like this. So yeah, the bicentennial was huge for me. It was everywhere. So it wasn't very hard to find it. Every newspaper and, every product had a bicentennial version of something.
And, one of the things that I've been thinking about today, Joanne, is that there are arguably, or maybe just rhetorically, there are more movies and maybe more good movies about shark attacks than there are about the American Revolution. And that's an odd thing. On the other hand, when you think about it a little bit harder, it's not surprising. In fact, let's go back to 1776, and you correct me if I have the history wrong on this, but the whole thing, a lot of the musical is about, well, are we going to declare independence? Are we going to do that thing? My understanding is that ultimately one of the important votes that was cast was Virginia, and one of the reasons Virginia was pretty radicalized was because of Lord Dunsmore, who was the royal governor there, who had set up this thing where if you were a black slave in Virginia, you could defect to the British. If you fought for the British, you could get your liberty. And Virginia was really, really unhappy about this. That's not the kind of thing that's going to work in a musical like 1776.
No, it's not. It didn't even work in the Declaration of Independence, where when you look at the original version of the Declaration of Independence, in one way or another, the crown is blamed for importing slaves into the colonies and for freeing enslaved people. So, yeah, to say that Americans were profoundly conflicted on the issue of slavery and that would be almost impossible to show on screen is an understatement.
So as we go along, and people do occasionally try to make movies about the American Revolution, we could probably skip over 1985's Hugh Hudson movie Revolution, which very few people except me ever saw. But
I did see it because it had Al Pacino in it.
Yeah. No, he's talking to Donald Sutherland. And he goes, "You're a British sergeant. You got to do what you got to do, and I got to do what I got to do. And now that we met face to face, if I got to put you down, I won't like it." No, he doesn't say that, but it doesn't really seem like it's particularly informative about the American Revolution.
Well, no. So there are a number of problems, I think, that confront any movie or TV show about the Revolution. And Revolution, the movie, had faced one of them, which is if you're not talking about, elite white guys that everyone knows, what's the story arc? Like, what story are you following? So, I mean, it's been a long time since I watched that movie, Revolution, but my memory is that there was a lot of fighting and rolling around in the muck, and it was like, the ground level experience of the Revolution, but it didn't get very far beyond a lot of fighting and rolling around in the muck.
Right. And so the other thing that has to happen, I think, in a lot of these is that the British have to be turned into these kind of Game of Thrones, Targaryen, war crime committing people who set their dogs on human beings and things like that. And so that's what brings us to, I believe, the year 2000 in the movie The Patriot. You're going to hear Tom Wilkinson as General Lord Charles Cornwallis and Mel Gibson as Benjamin Martin. Here we go. A1, Gene.
Now we come to the matter of the specific targeting of officers during engagements. Colonel, you must know that in civilized warfare, officers in the field must not be accorded inappropriate levels of hostile attention.
To your mind, what are appropriate levels of hostile attention?
Oh, Colonel, imagine the utter chaos that would follow from leaderless armies having at each other. There must be gentlemen in command to lead and where necessary, restrain their men.
Restrain them from, say, targeting civilians, women, children, and such.
That's a separate issue.
No. I consider them linked. And as long as your soldiers attack civilians, I will order the shooting of officers at the outset of every engagement. And my men are excellent marksmen.
Very well.
So there you have it. And we do have the British, maybe not so much as Cornwallis as the Jason Isaac character, just being these just abominable people. I don't know, maybe say a little bit. First of all, Joanne, did you see this in the movie theater? Do you remember?
Oh, yeah.
You may be entitled to $5 from Sony because, I'm not kidding, actually, because they had this fake reviewer. I think David Manning was his name, and he would put out these glowing reviews of Sony movies, and they got sued over it. And you may be eligible for $5.
I'll put in because that was an atrociously bad movie.
and say why you think it fails. I mean, I've kind of hinted at it already, but
it fails for a couple of reasons. But you're right. A big one is the movie makers decide that it's going to be about good guys and bad guys. Now, if you think about the Revolution and you think about the fact that British colonists were angry at their own government because they weren't being given the rights of British subjects, that's far more complicated than Nazi-like British. And so the Patriot really makes the British out to be these Nazi-like characters. And there's one scene where I guess that maybe the general's name is Tavington, and he's taken after Bannister Tarleton, who was actually in the Southern campaign, a British general. He rounds up colonists and he puts them in a church and he burns it down. Now, that didn't happen in the Revolution, but maybe Nazis, anyone watching that is what they would think of. So in essence, in the Patriot, the British are the Nazis so that then I guess we, the audience, can cheer for the Patriots to fight the evil Nazis, which, it's one of the reasons why it's hard to make a movie about the Revolution because there aren't clear bad guys in a Nazi kind of a way. The other thing that's horrible about this movie, among many, is it takes place in the South, in South Carolina, I think, and slavery is like invisible. This guy, so the Francis Martin, I think, is the name of the main character, who's taken after Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox. Yeah, he was a plantation owner in the South. And the movie just erases slavery. And anytime you encounter Black people in the movie, they're happy people. And if I remember correctly, there's like some island or something where Black and white are living happily together. And so there's no bad guy. And they deal with slavery by pretending essentially that it didn't exist.
Yeah, they go a little bit further, too. They actually have one of the enslaved men decide to participate militarily on the side of Mel Gibson and his Patriots. Numerically, that's kind of an insulting. I mean, I think 20,000 enslaved Black Americans defected and fought for the British cause because they could obtain their liberty, which would be at least 3 times as many Black people who as ever did that for the Patriot side. So, yeah, to the extent that slavery is visible, I think it's kind of presented in a pretty distorted way.
It is. And if I can say what might be obvious, but I'm going to say it anyway, generally speaking, if you think about how Americans think about their history, and particularly how some Americans today who happen to have a lot of political power would prefer to look at the Revolution and the founding, making it a story of heroes and whitewashing the reality of slavery and Black Americans from it seems pretty on target.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe we can sort of end a little bit with this, that ultimately, and we'll be talking more about Hamilton in the second segment. I know you have a lot of thoughts about Hamilton, having been on the ground floor, as they say, as kind of a consultant to Lin-Manuel Miranda. But I think prior to Hamilton, I think the culture that we're looking at is just carrying a lot of weight. You know, it is the origin story. It's this sort of American nativity story. This is how the whole thing gets started. So to have a lot of gritty reality and ambivalence, you can sort of understand why it's mythology rather than history, because in fact, maybe we're just primed for mythology in a way that we aren't for history.
That's true. And, I think where you started, 1776, I love that movie. And I have to say, even some of my students do, so it's lasted. It's not a great movie, but it is a good, bad movie. I'll put it that way. But, it's targeted.
Yeah.
So it largely takes place in one room.
Yes.
And it's people debating independence. So if one of the problems of portraying the revolution in popular culture has to do with there being a narrative arc because it's about ideas, among other things, well, hey, you solve part of the problem by putting guys in a room and having them talk about ideas. But it did, for me, as I said at the outset, what Hamilton, I think, did for a new generation of people, which is make this story and this period human in a multidimensional kind of a way. And particularly, as you said, when you're talking about an origin story that everybody wants to be a myth, that's a pretty good carry. Like that's a useful thing to do.
One of the other things they talk about a lot. Can you tell that I don't admire? I love musicals, which is why I have a problem with 1776. But one of the things that they do a lot in 1776 is complain about how hot it is. So,
that's true.
Like, they complain a lot about that. They're opening windows.
It's hot as hell in Philadelphia. Yes.
So I thank you, Joanne Freeman, for visiting us on this very hot day in America. Joanne Freeman is the Alan J. Bowles Professor of History and American Studies at Yale, and the host of 2 delightful podcasts, History Matters and So Does Coffee, and a few thoughts for those who can't sleep. Joanne, I know we'll talk again soon, but this was great.
Thanks so much for having me.
And we have a rowdy group. They're almost like colonials. We have some irregulars who are going to be on after this to talk about pop culture and the American Revolution.
Goddamn, will I declare, have you seen the like? Their walls are built of cannonballs. Their motto is don't tread on me. Come here, Uncle John's band, playing to the tide. Come with me or go on.
How does a ragtag volunteer army in need of a shower somehow defeat a global superpower? How do we emerge victorious from the quagmire? Leave the battlefield waving Betsy Ross's flag higher? Yo, turns out we have a secret weapon, an immigrant you know and love who's unafraid to step in. He's constantly confusing, confounding the British henchmen. Everyone give it up for America's favorite fighting Frenchman! I'm taking this horse by the reins, making red coats weather with blood stains. Then I'm never gonna stop until I make them drop, burn them up and scatter the remains down.
Oh, it pains me to fade that. It's one of my 27,000 favorite parts of the musical Hamilton. We are going to talk more about the American Revolution and popular culture with Nose panelist Rich Holland, founder and principal of CoLab, Hall of Fame designer and co-partner at Center. Gene Seymour, writer, professional spectator, pop culture maven and jazz geek. He writes That Gene Seymour Substack, which I heartily recommend to you. Lindsay Lee Wallace, a writer and journalist covering, we got to fix this, covering culture, health, technology, bats, and everything else that people will answer her questions about. And Bill Usman, professor of media studies at Sacred Heart University. If that sounds like a lot of panelists, it's because it is, but we're going to do this somehow. And Rich, we're going to have you get us going.
Oh my God.
So, well, there is a way in which Hamilton breaks a kind of logjam, right? And it's maybe not a logjam about the search for a really great American Revolution piece of popular culture, because as I think you've pointed out, it's not exactly about the revolution. Certainly the revolution's in there, but its ultimate statement is probably something a little bit different. But say how you see the role of Hamilton in what we're talking about.
Well, so up until Hamilton, the vast majority of movies about the revolution were about the revolution. And Hamilton came around and it suddenly became about the morning after, right? It became the story of like, okay, we did this thing. Now what? In a country struggling with what next, and where we end up landing on in a lot of ways is that defining what that postulates to me is that our defining identity is wrapped around this notion of argument. That we are the country of arguers. In a lot of ways, I think of say the French. We could say that they're the country of discernment, right? You know, they've been around forever. You know, they built chateaus. They gave us a sun king who politicized discernment in a lot of ways, right? And if I listen to that clip that you played earlier from the Patriot, the British that came from a very similar kind of place that the French might have, right? You know, similar length of history. They are about formalism in a lot of ways, right? You know, it's about form and, you know, and what's appropriate and how things are shaped is the identity that they take on. Doesn't mean that that's all they are, right? You know, far more complex than that. But the image that they put out is this idea of form. And by contrast, we put out this idea that we argue. That's what we're here to do. We're going to argue, and we're going to argue through this process of trying to become a more perfect blank. We started off with union, but we're still kind of sorting out if union is what we mean. And Hamilton feels like it kind of caught that fire, right? About trying to figure out like a more perfect what exactly. And also this idea that in pursuit of a more perfect, it's a thing that we actually never get to, right? You know, we are always putting ourselves in this position of debate and argument and contrasting and pushing for a refinement that the French in their bazillion years have decided, you know, that is just such an impetuous nation. Maybe we should just go with discernment instead and call it done for the day.
So let's get everybody else involved here. And before we do, since the subject of slavery has come up yet again, let's hear a little clip from John Adams. So maybe John Adams, one of the other defensible pieces of American Revolution related or adjacent pop culture. We will hear, of course, Paul Giamatti as John Adams. Tom Wilkinson again. He's actually there in the room where the Nose panelists are handing out baguettes right now, but that's a different movie. Tom Wilkinson as Benjamin Franklin, Stephen Delane as Thomas Jefferson. Here we go, B1 Gene.
The Christian king of Great Britain has waged cruel war against human nature itself in the persons of a distant people who never offended him. captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere.
Yes, you lay the evils of slavery at the feet of the king, but you say nothing of slavery itself, sir. Now, surely, if the trade is outlawed but ownership is not, then those unfortunate Negroes still in servitude will become a more lucrative commodity.
Well, that's not what I intended, Dr. Franklin. Slavery is an abomination and must be loudly proclaimed as such, but I own that neither I nor any man has any immediate solution to the problem.
Oh, but 'tis no matter. The issue before us is independence and not emancipation.
Dr. Franklin, this document is
something our friends in the Congress will debate, but I would be very surprised if they will countenance an attack on slavery.
You know, Gene Seymour, the person who's saying slavery is an abomination and must be loudly proclaimed as such, that's the Thomas Jefferson character. One of the things that I learned preparing for this show and learning more about these black regiments that fought for the British, and there were also tens of thousands of domestic enslaved people who defected to the British cause, not to fight, but to kind of do versions of what they were doing on the plantations, but for the British cause. One of the first things that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson demanded after the hostilities ended, they wanted their slaves back. Any of the slaves that could be found who had defected from them. That's that's how they celebrated freedom from the British. I think you've pointed out in the discussions leading up to this, this is a problem so granular, so embedded in the American story that steering around it doesn't work. But I don't know, even here, it's closer to working than you typically hear it, but I'd love to hear your reactions.
Well, listening to that clip again, I was reminded of our old pal F. Scott Fitzgerald's quote about the test of a first-rate intelligence is being able to hold two conflicting ideas and retain the ability to function. I'm not sure that's the test of a first-rate intelligence, but it is certainly an embedded characteristic of whatever we mean by the American mind. And slavery has been at the nexus of that from the very beginning. And I think it accounts, as I said in our earlier discussions, it accounts for the difficulty we've had in trying to find satisfying, and messianically satisfying pieces of art, drama, song. Still painting works. There's a lot of still paintings and statues. That works. But in every other art form, we've had a difficulty trying to accommodate those contradictions. And I think that the fact that slavery persisted after Yorktown remains even more so a kind of an embarrassment, at the very least, to Americans, despite the recent efforts to take out or omit references to slavery or diminish references to slavery in history. That has persisted, and it's something that it's like this big boulder in the road that we just can't get around, smash through, whatever.
Lindsay, one point that you made in the pre-show conversations, as I understand it, I think it's a really interesting idea, and I hope I'm expressing it the right way. This is a story about a country that is young, scrappy, and hungry. It's about the origins of the United States of America. But the United States of America are none of those things except maybe scrappy at this point. That this is a story told by a dominating world power about its underdog status, and that there's kind of a continuing tension between those two things. But I'd love you to say more.
Yeah, I mean, I think that everybody loves an underdog story. Everybody loves to root for whoever they think is least likely to win, but who has a lot of heart or whatever. And I think Americans like to think of the story of the revolution as one where we were, young, scrappy, and hungry, as Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote. But then also simultaneously, we want to be Toby Keith saying, and I have to quote this because my history teacher, Lindsay Wasserman, played it for me in 8th grade, "You'll be sorry you messed with the US of A. We'll put a boot in your ass. It's the American way," which is not something that inspires like feelings of this is an underdog that needs to be helped, or this is somebody who is on the David end of a David and Goliath dynamic. And like looking around the world today, the things that America is doing are, you know, acts of unspeakable evil on like a mundane policy level, and then on like a grandiose level, and things that we do to retaliate against, you know, actions that supposedly threaten our safety are often massively disproportionate to the actual threat that is being posed to us. But it's really dissonant with our internal identity to think of ourselves as the empire that somebody else might be resisting. And I think that, you know, when there's like a UFC fight on the White House lawn, for example, hypothetically, the kind of just like bravado and show that's being put on and like celebration of violence is something that is not in line with this idea that Rich was getting at about like a country of people who argue in order to try to advance ideals. And I think that there's like a sort of, in my opinion, a lack of excitement about this America 250 thing compared to what you might have expected. And I feel like the dissonance between like, is our story that of an underdog or that of like an Ubermensch? Is that really it's at a pinnacle? Like there are people who are being told that they need to continue supporting the current administration because they need to be protected from something, but they are the safest people in this country, the safest people in the world. So how much longer can an underdog delusion be maintained?
You know, Bill, I think also we do particularly sort of, and this is kind of a media studies thing, particularly in the world of popular entertainment. Popular entertainment works pretty well when there isn't a tremendous amount of gray, that there's black and white, that there's good and evil. And I think, as you pointed out, one of the reasons World War II movies work a certain way is because you could legitimately make the case that it is good versus evil, or at least a battle against evil. So say a little bit more about that and how it touches what we're talking about today.
Yeah, I don't want to argue that Hollywood is incapable of dealing with ambiguity, because I'm sure we could all reel off, a number of films that do that quite well. But in terms of creating popular entertainment, they do often have to, draw the battle lines very clearly, the good guys versus the bad guys. It was so interesting listening to Joanne Freeman in the first episode, because the stuff that she was saying, I think, meshes really nicely with some of the things we all were kind of talking about leading up to this episode, when she points out the British were not the Nazis, right? There's a lot to be opposed to monarchy and, all of that. I mean, we do have a social movement right now that's calling itself No Kings. And certainly the British Empire did create tremendous amount of death and suffering and misery and havoc throughout the entire world. But the other side of that coin is we, and I'm talking about America then and America now, we're not exactly the good angels either. If you look at all the complexities and the contradictions that we've already alluded to, with, the writer of the Declaration of Independence also being this slaveholder, and including in the Declaration a line about merciless Indian savages and what we were doing to their land, because this was theirs, of course. It's pretty hard to draw those battle lines as clearly as often Hollywood wants to do in order to, make something wildly popular.
Rich, I also wonder, we're going to run out of time here pretty quickly, but, we're talking about it as if it's kind of broken the same way that it's always been broken. But when I think about a play like 1776, and then I think about the 21st century culture that we're talking about now, not just Hamilton, but even that clip from Adams, and there's some other maybe less well-known stuff that we could delve into. There does seem to be some kind of grudging acknowledgement that telling this in comic book terms is just kind of not going to work. Non-inclusive comic book terms, I might add. But I don't know. Do you see reasons to be hopeful in the way that culture treats it now?
Actually, I do. And first of all, I do want to say that treating it in comic book terms might actually be the way. We just haven't been treating them in comic book terms enough. I think we need to raise it to like the graphic novel version.
We're going to have Gene talk about Philadelphia before this is all over.
Yeah.
But anyway, go ahead.
There's a recent
then it gets
Marvel comic
interesting.
series that puts the Avengers in 1776, by the way.
Yeah, that's also...
And if you... And
Anyway,
I think I mentioned,
finish your
I
thought,
mentioned
Rich.
earlier that my kid made me watch America, the motion picture, and it's insane. I am Pays there hanging out with George Washington. It gets a little crazy. And that gets far more interesting, right? But I think that at the heart of it, if we could hold on to Hamilton for just 1 second, right? How does a ragtag volunteer army in need of a shower somehow defeat a global superpower? Those are the movies that are actually being made right now, right? That's the history that we've got. But if we were to paraphrase that and look at it as, how does a ragtime volunteer army in need of a shower somehow grow up to become a global superpower? That movie's not being made because the process of that happening, in keeping with what Lindsay was saying, undermines our David and Goliath narrative, our underdog narrative that we like to have, right? Because that there does come a point in which who we are as a country, how we've evolved as a country, follows the track of what we've known about civilizations and societies since I first read The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, right? That there is a historical arc to this that we still haven't cracked the code on. Now, the promise of this country in its impetuousness right now, in its 250-year impetuous youthfulness, is that we're going to keep trying to resolve that for a different outcome, right? We've been at it 250 years. I don't know if we're at the point now where we could all judge and say that the experiment has failed, right? The experiment is struggling like crazy, and it had to, right? Because of the centuries of failure that existed before it.
I'm sort of reminded, I think it's in Love and Death where Woody Allen says, I wouldn't say God is dead. I think I might say he's an underachiever. It's a little bit of that, I think, that I hear what you're saying. So, Gene, we promised them before the end of the segment that you would tell them, this is not maybe the most high-minded note that we could end this segment on, but you should say something about Philadelphia.
Well, it's kind of hard to sort of elbow this into context here, but there is in fact a graphic novel series set in the present day in which an army of vampires led by none other than John Adams is terrorizing the people of Philadelphia, especially its minority population. And it's wild. I mean, it's almost see. I'm a fan of John Adams, and I personally find it a little slanderous that they're doing this to him. But I also think that it's been I think that there's something to the idea of that superpower thing that you were talking about being horned in to go down on some real underdogs. And I think part of the process of getting to that point you referred to, Rich, is sifting through these things and these contradictions. And I think narratives like that are a weird way, but a way of getting to that. So,
all right, we have to stop there. It breaks my heart because you're all so wonderful and you have many other things that you can say, and we usually treasure that. But we have more ground to cover and even more nose panelists to put on the air. So thanks to Lindsay Lee Wallace and to Bill Usman, to Rich Holland, and to Gene Seymour. We're going to take a little break. We're going to come back. It's always hard when our technical producer Dylan Reyes is off, but the good news is I get to work with the Jedi Master himself, Gene Amatruda, as our technical producer today, and Jonathan McNichol is the person assembling this wild episode of The Nose, where we're talking about how popular culture explores the questions and answers of the American Revolution. We're going to transition a little bit more to the stuff that we watch when we're kids. We're going to do that with R.S. Benedict, a writer and bureaucrat whose fiction and nonfiction has been published in the New Haven Review, Fangoria, Current Affairs, and a bunch of other places. Carolyn Payne, fresh off her La Dolce Vita experience in Europe, is an actress and comedian. She's founder and director of Kinetic Dance and the creative producer and choreographer for the Bushnell's Digital Institute. And Gene Seymour is back with us for this segment too, writer, professional spectator, pop culture maven, and jazz geek. He writes that Gene Seymour Substack, which I recommend. So we're going to begin actually with I guess it's a book and a movie. It's called Johnny Tremain. Before we have the panel comment on it, let's hear a little bit of the screen adaptation of Johnny Tremain. C1, please.
Countrymen, ships laden with English tea are now bound for this port. Shunned at a tested beverage, and let none be landed on these shores. What's this?
The most important piece of news in Boston.
Tea? But I like tea.
Almost everyone does. The English ministry has already collected a tax on this tea and added it to the price. Now, if we let that stuff in, every time we buy a pound of it, we'll be paying a tax we haven't voted. That's why we're printing these. To warn everyone of the real truth.
Well, who is we?
Sons of Liberty.
But who are you?
Everyone in Boston who believes their liberties are worth fighting for.
You can keep your politics. I'll stick to my trade and mind my own business.
Well, there you go. It's a 1957 Disney movie based on the 1944 children's novel. R.S., do you have childhood memories of this particular piece of culture?
I do. I think that was just as old-fashioned and corny as it was even when I was a young person. I think something about it just really struck me, and I guess that the story of a child with a hideously mangled hand going to war just maybe sparked my love of Cronenberg-style body horror. But I had a real soft spot for this one, and I think it's just because, you know, as a kid, you learn about history, and you kind of learn to think of every historical figure, especially from the 1700s, as people who just sort of posed for very important pictures in rooms, and that's kind of who they were. They were just big, important men, and this was a story indirectly about Paul Revere, and it was about how he had a day job. Like he
think the
he
blurb,
worked in a shop.
Yeah. I think the blurb is, "You had me at hideously mangled hand, R.S. Benedict."
Exactly. Just a horribly mangled child.
All right. Yeah, go ahead. Finish your thought.
But it really did appeal to me, just reminding me that, oh yeah, these were actually people, and the child is horribly injured because he goes to work as an apprentice for Paul Revere at his silver shop. And so, like, Paul Revere had to punch in and out. Maybe he had to deal with Karen type customers. He evidently did not have to deal with child labor laws or OSHA regulations because those weren't invented yet. But it kind of humanizes history in a little bit, as super old fashioned and corny as problematic as it was, and I kind of dug it.
So, Carolyn, you grew up in the greater Boston area, the epicenter of indoctrination for children about the virtues of the American Revolution. Say a little bit about Johnny Tremain first, and the role that you're playing with your nieces and nephews in trying to indoctrinate them too.
Yeah. So we read Tremain in school and watched the film version. And actually, incidentally, it's like one of my mom's favorite books. Like she pushed it at home, was always like, oh, read Johnny Tremain. Like every summer, it was like, that would be something that she think was great summer reading for us. I, on the other hand, as a child, was very disturbed by his mangled hand. But I feel like I had a great love of like American history and historical fiction as a kid for a couple of reasons. And one of them was growing up in Boston, like everything is Revolutionary War history. It was like they would tie like math lessons and be tied into like, you know, how many lanterns did Paul revere? And he like it just any subject became something about the Revolutionary War. And every field trip was to like Faneuil Hall and the Freedom Trail and visiting Lexington and Concord and going on the Boston Tea Party replica ship. So I just felt like this is a period of history that I feel like I know so much about and feels so vivid to me. And it really did, as a child, make me love things like Johnny Tremain, like the American Girl doll books, specifically Felicity, but just that kind of historical fiction in general. And I felt like I just like consumed more history coming from Boston because it felt like I was like, oh, I know where this is. I've seen this place. And it made it feel cooler. My nephews, on the other hand, go to school in Newton, where I grew up, and they do not seem to have that love. When we were watching things together, I was like rewatching things. They asked who the Redcoats were. And then one of them seemed confused about who Benjamin Franklin was. So maybe times they are changing and they are not leaning into this anymore.
So, Gene, one of the reasons that we, of course, do get indoctrinated as children is that we are exposed to culture like this, and then we remember only the time, forget about being able to think critically about it. We're not able to do that yet. But not only that, we barely remember what we remember. So, and I think that's your relationship to Johnny Tremain.
Yeah, it was a long time ago. And, as with Carolyn, I was raised in Hartford, Connecticut. I was in New England, and yes, one of the very first stories we were told, Colin, as you remember, was Nathan Hale,
yep.
our very own Connecticut hero. And I read Johnny Tremain at the right age, 11 years old, the right time, the early 1960s. To be an 11-year-old reading books back then was to be just sort of swamped with the love of history, because after all, in those few short years of the early 60s, we actually had a professional historian as president of the United States who encouraged us to do things like this. So yeah, I was besotted by it. Now, through the glasses I'm wearing now, there's a part of me that, well, I've come to know more about history, about myself, about my relationship to it. And I am far, far more aware of the absences in those works as anything else. Because later on, much later on, I came across the name of Crispus Attucks. And I thought, well, gee, so I guess there were people who looked like me back then, but what were they, how did they get into this? And what were they doing there? Those questions didn't really occur to me as prominently as they would when I was an 11-year-old. And yes, I too was swept up by the gothicness of his mangled hand. I admit it. I was not immune to those arcane charms. But
R.S. Benedict, see what you've started here. Hey, before we run out of time in this segment, R.S., I think one of the things that I might take away from Gene and Rich in the previous segment, and now a little bit from you and some of the things that you brought up too, is that maybe weird is one of the ways to come to grips with this, that when we try to do something semi-realistically, when we wind up making a movie like The Patriot, when we do something like Hamilton, we do something marvelous where we take people who have a very, very different story and kind of put them in the names and costumes of this other story and kind of combine two different American narratives. But you brought up, among other things, a recent episode of The Regular Show, which my grandson, I think, is watching right now. And also, very interestingly, John Carpenter's The Fog. I don't know, pick one of those two and just kind of explain how it connects.
I guess I'll talk about John Carpenter's The Fog. It's not exactly about the revolution, but it's indirectly about the bicentennial. It was very much made during the bicentennial and takes place during a small California island town's centennial celebration, and it's about a bunch of zombie lepers who kill people during a foggy night, and it's pretty great. It's sort of a metaphor for the reappraisal of American history that was going on during that time, and our changing relationship to our own history, our changing perception of our founders, and how heroic were they, and how heroic really is the story of the United States. And as well, as goofy as an old horror movie is, it's very much about that, and not an even remotely subtle way, because John Carpenter does not do subtlety. And I'm thinking about it a little bit as we're doing our 250 year celebration.
All right, so we're going to add one more nose panelist, possibly breaking some kind of record. But Jim Chapdelaine is joining us, Emmy-winning musician, patient advocate for people with rare cancers, many other things besides. Gene and Bill are also around for this if we have time. But Jim, it is, I think, arguably Ken Burns and his whole team set out, they actually look at a lot of the problems that we've brought up here, the omissions in particular that have been brought up here, the failure to consider different points of view. I mean, right from the get-go, they say kind of the indigenous people point of view is just sort of not part of the typical tale that we're told. So I don't know, Jim, say how you think that worked out. How good a corrective was it?
I think Ken Burns has kind of been institutionalized in the way that 60 Minutes used to be institutionalized. Like the minute we hear the narrator, Peter Coyote, we go, oh, this is going to be great. It's not always great, but his take on the revolution is great because he does a 360. And I don't know that that's been done before, where he's trying to cover all the bases, not just a single base. It's been done. Some of these things have been covered, slavery, for example, but not in the context of this is part of the whole picture. And I think the series he did was great. I just rewatched it before driving over there today and driving back. And I don't know. He's kind of like an American institution, and I think that he. On this kind of stuff, the true history stuff, he usually hits it hard.
Bill, one of the things that I noticed is that the historian Maya Jasanoff in the Burns doc, she talks about how coming to terms with the Revolutionary War is almost impossible. The stakes are so high, the events are so complex, the mythology is so entrenched that it has made the way Americans think about this period very unreal and detached. And so as we end here, Bill, we're sort of ending on a note of failure, but in a way acknowledging the impossibility of having a really realistic appraisal of something that's both a dream and a reality, and a huge emotional and spiritual investment for Americans. Maybe that's a good place to end the show today, Bill.
Yeah, I think so. I'll just say really quickly, Pete Hegseth would hate the Ken Burns documentary. And the reason he would is because it really dives into all that complexity. I shared with my co-panelists a James Baldwin quote that I just love, which is, American history is longer, larger, more various, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever said about it. And I feel like this new Ken Burns documentary really tries to show that beauty and that terror simultaneously.
All right, so let's build on what Bill said, but end with the somewhat anodyne music from Johnny Tremaine. A little sunshine here at the end of this conversation. Thanks to all of you for listening. Thanks for all the great panelists for making their time our time for a while.
Yes, we are the sons of liberty. It will grow as we grow, boys. It will be as strong as we. We must cling to our faith, boys. Faith in the liberty tree. It's a tall old tree and a strong old tree. And we are the sons